Hello and welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. My name's Craig James, and I'm the president of Bayside Regional Tennis Association. On behalf of them and Moorabbin and Districts Junior Tennis Association, I'd like to welcome you to our tennis equipment webinar this evening. And with me, I'm joined by Tim Batty from Brighton Sports. Hi, Tim.
Craig, how you going?
Very well, thank you. So we've got a bit of a presentation we're going to take everybody through tonight. Tim is going to give you some information on equipment and how it can help your game, and hopefully at the end we'll be able to give you some pointers to really help you improve your game through your equipment. If you want to ask a question, the chat is operating. You can just put a note there in the question. I notice we've got Luca with us and Angelina at the moment, and Savannah is with us as well. If you've got any questions, please do that. Now, if you're watching it as a recording, which this will go onto our website as a recording, feel free to please ask a question, and it will be emailed to Brighton Sports, and Tim will come back to you by email and answer it to you. So if you're not here live, that's okay. So let's get started. We've got a little presentation to do. I will find the right buttons to press here.
There I am.
There we are. We've dropped down. There's Tim at his shop. You don't need me in the corner. We only need Tim there. So as I said, we're going to look at strings mainly here tonight, and we'll touch briefly on rackets. I don't know how deep we'll get into the whole racket thing, because there's a lot of different rackets, as you can see behind Tim, and we've got some other shots of him later. There's a lot of different rackets at the store. So let's go to the next slide. So Tim, tell us about players and their rackets, I guess.
Well, I suppose what we find, we have a range of different players that come into our club that range from beginners through to social, pretty high-level club players, and we also have a few pro players who come through, mainly because of the fact that we deal with their coaches on a daily basis. I suppose by reading what you see in front of the screen there, that 80% of players are currently using rackets or strings that are suboptimal for their game. Look, that's certainly true. I'd like to think that probably is changing over time, purely because of the fact that all the stores in Melbourne, not just mine, but we're offering demonstration programs so people can come and test rackets. And from our perspective, we're actually, you'll even hear us in store, people will just come in and try to pick a racket off the shelf and walk out the door because they couldn't be bothered testing it. And we're actually the other way. We're actually trying to not force them, but to coerce them into the demo program, so they can take a few rackets out free of charge for a few days. And then when they come back and they buy a racket, they've actually played with it, they can feel it, they can make an educated decision.
Yeah, that sounds good. So obviously, if you could tell us, why is it so hard for a player to find the right racket?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons. You've got a lot of people who like particularly the beginners, even not just juniors, but adults, who want to pick up a tennis racket. So a lot of them sort of will walk into these stores like Rebel or places like that and pick a racket off the shelf. And to be honest, those types of stores aren't really geared up to be providing expert advice. And in Melbourne, there are a number of specialist tennis stores around. And the difference being there is that when people come in, we can actually talk to them about their tennis game. So you'll hear questions if you're in the store with me. I'll be asking questions such as, how often do you play? What racket are you currently playing with? Do you hit a lot of top spin? Are you playing singles or doubles? Are you a baseliner or a volleyer? And all these things are not just important about trying to assess what rackets we would offer for demonstration, but if they end up buying a racket, it's also really important, or probably even more important, with regards to selecting string options for a player. So even in my shop in Brighton, we've got 80 to 100 adult rackets on the wall. So if you look at that from an adult's perspective, I mean, and then you add in the fact that we use probably 70 different types of strings, and there's probably 30 or 40 different tension ranges you can put through those, or hybrids where you combine strings together. I mean, the options in there, they're just too hard to deal with. So that's why people like myself and Donna, we're there to try and guide you and educate you and find out, basically where your game's at, where you want it to be, and what would be the most suitable setup for you.
Yeah, and as you can see, if you multiply those options you gave us out to their ultimate end game, if you like, if you're a kid, you can have up to 60,000 different combinations, excluding your string combinations, and over 1 million with the adults if you take into all the different mass sizes and head sizes, lengths, and string.
Look, it's off the charts. And, you know, we get a lot of people that range from people who've got no idea, walk in the door, want a racket. I suppose the one we have most of our fun with are teenagers, particularly teenage boys who read a lot of stuff off the web and they want to emulate their favourite player. So they're prepared just to come in and buy a racket because Rafa or Dominic Thiem uses it. And in a lot of cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, those rackets just don't suit those kids. So what we're trying to do, and you know, rackets nowadays, Craig, you'll know this as a tennis parent, but rackets now for a good racket for a good player, they're circa $300, $330 per racket.
Sure.
So you want to make sure that if you're going to be spending that sort of money on a racket for, you know, somebody who's going to be playing a bit, you want the racket to be right.
Yeah, to get it fitted. And here's an interesting statistic that I always like the look of. This is from Tennis Australia, this statistic, that if you're a performance player, in a year you might spend 675 hours practicing, but you will spend 1 hour in your year picking the racket. And given that's the part that actually hits the ball, it's probably a very important statistic to be aware of.
Yeah, keeping in mind for the fact that that's only selecting the racket. Myself as a tennis player and as a number of other tennis players, I'm actually more particular about the strings and the tension than I am about the frame. So if it's 1 hour selecting their racket, I tell you what, selecting the string, they would probably only spend 10 minutes. And that's where basically all the education comes in. And I think probably more important than the frame is the stringing.
Yeah. All right. So, and that brings us to the stringing because, as you said, the string's the part that actually hits the ball. And I know you've got some great stringing machines down there at Brighton. Donna has her favourite. You have your favourite.
Oh, we're very particular. We're very lucky. We've got probably the number 1 and number 2 stringing machines available on the market in our shop. So the first one, the one that Donna would predominantly use, is the Wilson Bayardo, an amazing stringing machine, fully electronic, calibrated to within like a 0.01% of accuracy. And it's the machines they still use with the Wilson string team at the US Open. So current machine, fantastic. Myself, I string on that. I've got one of those Bayardos also down at my Geelong shop, and I string on that when I'm down there. But my favourite machine, which I string on in the shop, is the Yonex ProTech machine. It is the machine that they use at the Australian Open. In fact, the machine that I have in the shop was used at the Australian Open. And I just find for the way I string, and it's hard to explain if you're not a stringer, but I find that it's probably, 5 minutes per racket faster for me stringing on that. And so that's what I choose. And, to be fair, they're quite expensive, but when we're stringing as many rackets as we do on a monthly basis, they're our primary tools, and so we make sure that we've got the best available.
Yeah. And now there are so many string types. You've got natural gut. We've got all the different types of synthetic. So there's natural gut, and then everything else is, I guess, a synthetic tennis string, whether that be nylon, synthetic gut, multi-filament, polyester, or Kevlar. There's a couple of other more obscure types of string there, which we won't bother with, but they're pretty obscure. So we've got this. That's the making of natural gut. Tell us a bit about natural gut.
Well, look, some people still come to my store and refer to it as cat gut, and I don't know where they get that from because cat stomachs have never been used. The natural gut is actually comes from cow stomachs of all things, and is probably still it's the most beautiful, powerful, soft-filled tennis string you can get. But unfortunately nowadays, it's horrendously expensive, which makes it quite cost prohibitive for the average person to want to play with it. So, for example, to string a natural gut bed of strings, mains and crosses all the way through, including labour, is about $100 string job. Now I've got a lot of older people who will want that because they need the feel because they've got sore arms or they're just used to it. But if you're talking to players who are playing a power game with a lot of spin multiple times per week, they'll chew through these strings like every hour. So they are a beautiful string, very commonly used on the tour now as a cross string or a main string for hybrid setup. So, for example, Roger Federer uses natural gut in his mains, but he uses ALU power, also known as banger, in his crosses. So, and we'll get to the more details of these strings, but basically, in essence, softness and feel and power of the natural gut and more control and durability of the ALU power. So he finds that's a nice combination for him.
Excellent. And so here's a bit of a cross-section of the various string and what are most players using?
Oh, look, to be honest, if you take all that stuff out of it and look at things in basically two categories, there's multi-filament, and forgetting the gut for the time being, but commonly on the market, there's multi-filament and there are poly strings. So if you have a look at the durable polys and Kevlar, Kevlar is old school, really brittle, hard on the arm. Not many people use it anymore. The main difference between polyester and multi-filament, in essence, comes down to one or two things. A, polyester strings have got a hard core of them, and they're more durable. That's their key element. Multi-filaments, though, they're all woven strings, so they're softer, so they have more spring and elasticity in them. They give more snapback, and they're soft on the arm. And because they are a woven string, you'll notice that when you play with natural gut, is that when they are starting to get ready to break, they start to fray. You can actually see the degeneration of the string when you're playing. But basically, you're talking about comfort versus durability is one of the primary differences between multi-filament and polyester. Yeah.
So if I came in and just said, "Can you restring my racket?" It would probably depend on my budget in the end, wouldn't it?
Yeah, look, for example, I'm just going to talk about my shop, but I've got a pretty good relationship with all the other tennis shops in Melbourne, and we all string pretty much at the same price, and we all pretty much string the same range of strings because they're our core strings that basically all shops need to have, and basically things like you'll hear them commonly: RPM Blast, Vocal Cyclone, Wilson Sensation, Head Links, Yonex Polypro, etc. All common strings, very popular strings used by all of us. But we would ask you very particular questions. So, Craig, you come in the door and say, look, I've got this racket. I haven't strung it for a while. And again, as I said before, I'd be asking whether you're a singles or doubles player, whether you're a baseline or a volleyer, whether you're a flat or topspin slice, and take all those things into account. Do you have any arm problems, right? Things like that, because if you came in and said, I've got a horrendously bad tennis elbow, I would not be putting you anywhere near a polyester string, and certainly not something really, really durable and too heavy. I'd be going straight for a multi-filament, and if you're that way inclined, I'd even push it towards a natural gut string.
Excellent. Now, the strings we've seen different types of strings, but the other thing we haven't discussed is the different gauges of strings. A gauge, can you explain what a gauge of a string is and what that achieves?
Well, gauge is basically the diameter of the string. So basically, if you have a look at the diagram you have up there, you've got thicker strings 1.35, 1.40. I can tell you quite now, I mean, people probably use them. In our shop, we've never strung with a 1.35 and above string. It's just it's a very old school type string. They're usually quite brittle, and they just don't sort of seem to fit with the rackets of today. So just to step away from the strings for 1 second, all the new rackets that are coming out in the market, well, I can't say all, but a very, very large percentage of the rackets coming out in the market nowadays are moving towards being more of a feel racket. All right. So things like, the Wilson Clash has got a really flexy throat, and it's a really, really a feel racket. The Vocal rackets are feel rackets. Even the new Head Extremes have got a bit more feel to them. So trouble is, if you're going to have feel rackets, there's no point putting in overly heavy, thick string. It defeats the purpose of the racket. So you'll find in our shop, the bulk of our stringing is done around the 1.25 mark, around the 16 gauge. We have quite a few strings in the 1.3 range, and we do have a couple down around the 1.15, 1.2 range. But again, the thinner you go, you're going to get more power and spin, but you're also going to snap them a lot faster. So, and certain strings, without going right into too much detail because it'll bore everybody, but certain strings just don't work well in certain rackets. And some of the rackets, for example, which are classified as spin rackets, which have wider drill patterns in their frames, which leaves more spacing between the strings to get more bite on the ball. If you've got somebody who's quite a good player using a spin racket with one of these open string patterns, they're going to break strings all day, every day. So it comes down again to practicality versus cost, and also feel versus durability.
Okay, so thanks for that. That's a great description of gauge. The next thing is, what tension do I string at, and what impact does that tension have on the way I play? You hear all sorts of things about pounds and different ways we can go about it.
Tension's a funny thing, and like, I'm involved in a lot of stringing forums, and there's a lot of common consensus between stringers globally, and there's a lot of little arguments that go on between stringers as well. Let's just rule out one thing, which I think a lot of people have a bit of quite a common mistake they make, is that by tightening your strings in, it does not give you more power. That is consensus across the board. So if you want to get more power out of your strings, you need to start going into lower tensions, right? And the reason being is, you can see in the diagram, if you see how where the ball is sitting on the frame and how the strings are below frame level, so they're sinking in and then they snap back and they push the ball out like with a trampoline type effect. So that low tension is giving you the power. If you ever watch the Australian Open or even the US Open, they'll show slow-mo of balls hitting strings, and you'll see exactly what it means, where the strings are basically bending back and then pushing the ball out. So what happens is it just gives you more power. Now, conversely, if you're a bit more of a and one more thing, probably more suitable to your baseliners. Now, let's be honest, in today's sort of tennis players, most people are baseliners, and some people will volley if they have to, but there's a lot of people nowadays who are just natural serve volleyers. Where you go into the higher tension, you'll see that the snapback on that diagram is far less, and therefore the ball's not like staying on the strings as long, and it's giving you more control. So, in the good old days, when I was playing like State 1 pennant, I was stringing my rackets up at 67, 68. Bjorn Borg in the 80s was up in the 80s. Kei Nishikori is down at 35 pounds. Because I don't know if you've ever seen Kei Nishikori come to the net. I don't think I have. And so he's a pure baseliner. But the other thing is as well is that we have people who put the mains in at one tension and they put the crosses in at another tension. Which is all very well and good if you're using two totally different strings. But if I've got the same string, for example, I'm putting, head links in the mains and crosses, having them at a different tension for the mains or the crosses is a complete waste of time. But if I was to put in a heavy string in the mains and a softer string in the crosses, then I might adjust that tension to allow for better snapback or better power. So, we record in our shop. We record every stringing job that goes out. So, for example, when we have Savannah's racket come in, or yours, or anybody else's, we can go back and look at the history and talk to you about, well, last time you were here, we put this string in and we put these tensions in. What did you think? And you might come back and say, well, we like the string, but we want to get a bit more power. So we sort of really try to work with making sure that your setup is different. And between winter and summer as well, you want to change your tensions because wet balls and humid air and things like that have an effect on your stringing.
Yep. I think there's a very celebrated case last year of Dylan Alcott, our wheelchair Grand Slam champion. He last year moved his rackets from 55 pounds down to 42. So he could get more power as a result
absolutely.
of that. And
look, it's a lot of the frames now, some of the frames that are coming out are actually recommending that you go down lower in tension. And here's another quick thing you need to understand. If you have a look at your frames, anybody's got their rackets there, most frames will have the recommended tension range within the throat or somewhere on the racket for you to have a look at. Now, say, for example, most rackets come out with a range somewhere between, they'll say 55 plus or minus 5 pounds, or 48 to 53, or whatever it happens to be. But when you have a look at what that mid-range number is, that number that they are putting on the rackets is actually still aimed at your stringing with natural gut, right? So, for example, if you buy a brand new Babolat Pure Aero, which is quite a stiff racket, and you came to me and it was mid-range 55 and you wanted to put RPM Blast, which is a very durable string in there, that is going to play like a plank. So what we do is we tend to sort of go down on the slightly lower side of the recommended tension if somebody is certainly putting a polyester string in, right? Because it needs to be softer on the arm, because you've got to understand, if you put a brittle string in a stiff racket at a high tension, the potential to do damage to your arm just goes up exponentially.
Yeah, okay, great. Now, here's an interesting one. I know a lot of players have shock absorbers in their rackets, the shock dampening. So here is a grid, and this is the oscillations of a racket with and without a vibration dampener. The top one is if you have a vibration dampener in, and the bottom one is without a vibration dampener.
Do you see much difference?
No, but the smiley faces look really good on your racket.
Well, look, I mean, I've had some very, very contentious discussions with people about this. I'm not a dampener person, and I sometimes feel guilty about even selling dampeners to people. But yes, they do have smiley faces and funny little slogans on them and all that sort of thing. But I've found personally, it's not so much the vibration dampening, but when you put them in your rackets, they actually change the noise of the ball coming off the strings. And being an old school, old grumpy man that I am, I actually like my rackets to sound like they were intended to be. So vibration dampeners, some coaches I know won't let their students play without one in their racket. That's not a word of a lie. I've had that feedback. Me personally, I don't see the point, but hey, if you come into my store, I've got lots of vibration dampeners you can choose from to satisfy your itch.
And given the price of vibration dampeners, you're not going to be retiring soon on the side.
Yeah, no, they average about $5.95. So unless I get a run of a million of those coming in over the next few weeks, I won't be going anywhere.
Okay. Now, one of the variations we have on rackets, and it also has a bit of an issue whether you're coming from Europe or the United States, is how they actually say the racket size. So how do I actually measure to say that I've got the right size grip for my racket?
Okay, so I mean, you've got the rule there, and that can sort of help you do a bit. The way we do it is if you grab, if you basically get your forehand grip and you put it on a normal tennis racket. And do you want me to grab a racket to show you what I mean?
If you got one handy, yeah, sure, why not?
Hold on 1 second, I'll be back.
Yep.
All right. So the racket I'm using here at the moment, just so you've probably not seen this before, this is a limited edition Wilson Blade 98 Roland Garros racket. So basically, if you have a look at the rackets, look at the handle. If I grab, I'm being a lefty, so I'm a lefty, I grab the racket as such, and if I just turn my hand around, you can see that I've got a gap in between my fingers and my thumb. And so what happens is, what I do is I take the index finger off my other hand and I lay it in between the end of my fingers and the inside of my thumb there. So what happens if that's a nice snug fit, then that's pretty much the grip size that we use. So for example, this one I've got on my hand is a 4 1/4. So I've got small hands for a guy. So what I do is I use a 4 1/4 racket, but it's a little bit too small. So what I do is I put an overgrip over the top, and an overgrip will take you up about half a grip size. So I'm playing with just under a 4 3/8. But if I grab a 4 3/8 racket and put an overgrip over the top of it, it's too big. So there's no clear delineation. I know some people who've got their fingers absolutely overlapping, nearly touching, and they like that. The danger is if your grip is too small, it's end up what they call choking the racket. And because you're gripping so hard onto the racket to try and keep in your hand, you can actually have effect up your arms and also in the tennis elbow. So, but what we do is with our demo programs, for example, we allow people to go and hit with the rackets, and they can feel the grip size, and we can basically give them feedback as well and say, when you hit with that, what was that grip size? Was it comfortable? And if it is, then that's the matching grip size. If not, we can go up or down from there. But if you look at that chart there, it's fairly sort of accurate as description. Most men would play with a 4 3/8. Guys like myself who've got slightly smaller hands play with a 4 1/4. There are a few guys who've got monster hands who play with a 4 1/2. And I can tell you now, I haven't seen a grip with a 4 5/8 on it in I don't know how long. Most kids, when they're coming out from juniors, so if you look at grip size 0 there, all junior rackets, so 26 inches or below, come in whatever grip size the racket comes in, right? They don't have variations. Whereas most kids coming across might go to a grip 1, which is 4 1/8, unless they've got slightly bigger hands for it. But we can, like I said, you come into my shop or we go in any specialist tennis shop, they can match that to you at any stage. Not a problem.
All right, and that sort of brings us to our next subject, which is the sizing of our racket. That's the length of it from the butt to the head. Now,
yep.
Tennis, it's unusual in tennis. There is actually no official size for a tennis racket. You can legally play on the tennis tour, I think, with up to 29-inch long rackets. No, I don't think anybody does, but I think it's legal to go to 29.
I mean, look, I don't. There are probably some custom racket brands out there that do that. Like I know Babolat and Wilson. I think a couple of the brands actually do have 27.5-inch rackets available. I know that in my store, there's only one racket in my store that comes in as a 27.5-inch, and that is the Wilson Blade 104, which was the Serena Williams racket. But that comes at 20. Everything else comes at 27-inch. And if you have a look there, 19, 21, 23, 25, I mean, the ages are indicative. There's a couple of things that come into play with that. And we usually go by a coach's recommendation on this. I mean, because for example, I see lots of people on a daily basis, but I don't get to see their kids play on a daily basis. So we would suggest talking to a coach and getting the feel, because it comes down to how strong the kid is. Can they handle a bigger racket? What level of tennis they're playing, and basically the bigger head size. And obviously, as you go longer, you need to be able to get better spacing to the ball. So the other couple of things we have in here as well to keep in mind is that in 19 and 21 and 23-inch rackets, I mean, pretty much on the market, they're only available in basic alloys, right? Pretty much. Whereas when you get into the 25 and 26, it doesn't actually have 26-inch rackets on here, because 26-inch is the biggest of the junior rackets. And the 26-inch and the 25-inch rackets come in 3 models. So they come in either an alloy, a very basic one, a graph alloy sort of hybrid, which is sort of an intermediate racket. And then they have full graphite rackets, which are like a junior version of an adult racket. But and then you go to 27s. So all adult rackets are 27s. So yeah, so there's a lot of factors in there. Most junior rackets pretty much play the same, especially when you're talking about alloys, 19, 21, 23. They're very basic. They vibrate a bit, but they're really good if you're learning. And again, we would recommend to people that they would get advice from their coaches, because the coach will be able to tell you straight up whether a kid, for example, might be on a 25, would bypass a 26 and go straight to a lightweight adult, for example.
Yeah, sure. I think when I commented on 29 being the legal maximum, I wasn't suggesting there are many rackets at 29, but just that's what the rules of tennis say. You can play with anything up to 29, but nobody makes them, because I'm guessing they would be very hard to swing and control.
Oh, yeah, look, there may be a couple of specialist racket brands out there, which are guys who make them sort of custom type stuff, but certainly in the major brands, 27.5 is the longest that we have seen, over the last 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions coming in, which we'll get to at the end, but we'll take one now from Savannah. She said, if you had tennis elbow, would you recommend a heavier or lighter racket?
Well, and that's actually a really good question, and not that simple to answer. So in most cases, we would say to somebody to go into a lighter racket with a softer tension and definitely with a multi-filament string, right? But saying that, we've seen with some people, depending on the type and the severity of their tennis elbow, we've seen them actually stay, not so much going into lighter rackets, but staying with their racket, and in some cases increasing the tension of the string and actually putting firm string. Some people have actually gone into rackets with bigger grip sizes as well, because if their grip size is too small and they were choking the racket, as we discussed before, they've tried that option. So there's no like really basic answer to that. I mean, I can tell you now, I had chronic tennis elbow. I was about 15 or 16, and I was trying to play in state junior squads and do all that sort of stuff. I ended up having like injections into my arm, and that didn't work. And one day, 6 months later, it miraculously went away and never came back. And I hadn't changed anything. Yeah. So I think what you would do, first of all, you'd probably go to a softer string with a softer tension, and then work your way through that. So, and I'll give you an example. Was a racket brand out there with a lot of kids particularly wouldn't know, called Volkl, which is Volkl. And Volkl, we stock these rackets in our store, and they have a wide range of rackets, but there are a couple of rackets, there's about 3 or 4 rackets particularly in their range that are designed as what they call feel rackets, aimed at people with tennis elbow to take pressure off their arms.
Okay, that's an interesting thing. I hadn't heard of that. So that brings us to our next slide too. Also, that a racket is not a racket. They all have different head sizes. So we've talked about different lengths, different grip sizes.
Oh, yeah.
And now the head sizes. I know when I started, when I was playing back in my, well, let's say 30 years ago, I used Prince rackets.
Yep.
And they had the big oversized heads. And of course, that had to be better because there was more. It was easier to hit the ball because there was more space on the frame.
Oh, yeah. So they're the old Prince Woodies, Prince Classic.
Prince Woodies.
Yeah. So if you have a look at your chart there where it says like less than 95 square inch for a mid-size. So look at a guy like Roger Federer. He was playing with 93 square inch pro staffs. He still plays with pro staffs. He went to the 95s, and now as he's getting older, he's on the 97s, 97 square inch. Now, keep in mind, 97 square inch is still actually small than your average. Your average racket nowadays is a 100 square inch racket. So if you walk in any shop, 80, 90% of the rackets available on the shelf are going to be 100 square inch. And they're the ones that sort of suit everybody. Reasonable control, reasonable power, easy to use. The mid-size ones or the smaller ones, they're really aimed at control players. I mean, you need to be hitting the ball nearly in the middle all day, every day, or you're going to struggle. I can tell you now, if you came down and had a hit with a Federer Pro staff, if you weren't hitting the ball in the middle the whole day, that thing would just do your head in. Conversely, go to the other end to the oversized, the 105 pluses. Now, there's a racket which we actually sell in our shop. Everybody in the world sells it, called a Head TIS6. And Head TIS6 is a 115 square inch head, 240 grams, super light racket, and it's probably sold more rackets in the history of any tennis racket ever. And the reason why, it's really easy on the arm, and a lot of older people play with it because they don't have to have a full swing to use it. It's more like a bit of a tippy-tappy, you get lots of power without having to generate a lot of arm speed. Your trade-off of that, though, is you don't get a lot of control. But a lot of, and not being terrible, a lot of the midweek ladies that I deal with through both my shops, they use the oversized rackets because it's just easier on their arm.
Excellent. Yeah, and that probably answers one of the questions we've got here from Savannah, advantages and disadvantages of having a big racket head. And I guess if you just have to look at the Pro Tour to see, there was a period there where some of them were used. Back in the 70s, there was a period where some of them were using the bigger head rackets. But nowadays, as you said, with Federer at 97, they're all in that 95 to 100 range, really, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And what you'll see now, in fact, there's a racket being released. I can say it. There's a racket coming out from Wilson in September. It's an addition to their blade range. It's actually the Serena, what they call the Serena Williams spec. It's a 102 square inch. So it's actually slightly oversized, but it's 305 grams. So it's quite heavy. So it's an unusual combination to have an oversized racket with over 300 grams in weight. It's a bit unique. So, but generally, I would be saying to kids, if you come in, look at the hundreds, unless you're like a beginning junior, but you're going into a junior adult racket, a lightweight adult racket. We've got 102 and 105 square inch rackets. But most coaches, Craig, they want their kids in 100 square inch because they don't want them on the bigger ones. They want them on something which is going to be, what they're going to be playing with going forward. Yeah.
Okay. And another variation we can get in our rackets is the string pattern. I notice when models are coming out now, and to be fair, there's a side that some have 16, 19 too, don't they? And
most 16, 19. Most rackets are 16, 19. You do get a few 16, 18s. And then most rackets, certainly performance rackets, have 18 by 20 options. Now, in our shop, a lot of 16, 19s, a few 16, 18s. 18, 20s, probably a little bit less there because they are so particular. You really need to be hitting the ball in the center the whole time. The big difference is, you can't really tell from these diagrams, it's just the spacing of the gap between the strings. So with a 16, 18, the actual squares between the strings on the face of the racket, they're actually significantly noticeably wider apart in opposition to an 18, 20. And that extra space allows the ball to sit on the strings and grab more and generate spin and generate power. Whereas when you've got them closed together on an 18, 20, the ball literally is just hitting the strings and it's straight off. Off it goes.
Okay, excellent. So the next slide talks about trying to if you're a player, is this a fair enough commentary on what you should be looking for in a racket?
Well, there's a couple of things. You need to be able to make sure, like, for example, one thing we talk to people about when they're demoing rackets from us, and first thing I would say is always demo a racket, regardless of what tennis store you deal with, demo a racket. And if the store you're dealing with doesn't demo rackets, find a store that does, because you need to hit with the racket before you buy it. It's really, really simple. And even though your favorite player uses this racket and you want to be exactly like them, I understand that. We've all been through that. But you'll find in a lot of cases that racket doesn't suit you. So there's a few things. You've got to have the weight right, and that can only come by going out and hitting with it. Secondly, you've got to have the grip size right, because that has significant impact on your arm. The third thing is, once you pick the frame, we've got to get the string and the string type right, because if I give you a racket that's too heavy, and I usually put it down this way, if you're using one of my demo rackets and you went and had a hit for an hour or two, or you played a couple of sets of night tennis on a Tuesday night, and at the end of that 2 hours, your arm and shoulder was sort of laboring because you'd been playing with, something a little bit too heavy, then that racket is not for you. If you wake up the following morning after playing with that racket and your arm hurts and it's just you're really struggling, then that racket is not for you. So if it's too heavy, you won't get any racket head speed. And here's a simple thing to remember. The more weight that you can take in a racket, by default, you'll get more power. So if I was to say with a nice, easy swing, if I could do a nice, easy swing with a heavier racket, then say, for example, with a 300-gram racket in opposition to a 280-gram racket, I'm going to get more power out of the 300-gram racket. No doubt. The question is that sustainable? Like if I'm playing junior tennis on a Saturday morning or senior tennis on a Saturday afternoon, can I last the whole afternoon playing with that weight? And you need to factor that in, because for people who are going to be playing and pretty serious at their tennis, and they're doing squads and private lessons and want to do association state squads, and you're hitting a few hours a day every day, you can't go too heavy. If you go too heavy, as it says there, you'll compromise your swing and you'll compromise your technique. You'll end up being injured. And that's the thing we see a lot of. We just see is that people picking the wrong rackets and then coming back in a couple of weeks later because they didn't want to demo it. They just want a racket. And the first thing they say is, I play this, it hurts my arm. What can I do? And you go, well, I can't really do too much for you. That's why we have the demo program. So be patient is what I would say. Be prepared. If you want to change rackets, be prepared that it's somewhere probably between a 1 to 2, 3 week process. You've got to try some rackets. And say, for example, you take 3 rackets out and you really like 2 of them. So you might come back, ditch the third one, and then go and pick up another third racket to go out and try it so you can compare them. But there's also I had a guy who took out 25 rackets over a 4-week period. It was ridiculous. He was just going back into a cycle of using the same rackets over and over and over again. But I think usually if you get 6 rackets and we've helped you select those 6, with those 6 rackets, one of those there we could probably match pretty well to you. And then the harder part is matching your stringing and your tension to the racket.
That's excellent. That's a really good explanation. So just we've only got 2 or 3 more slides to go. So just sort of wrapping up, the top tips for creating good equipment habits. The first tip we've got for people to help them have good equipment habits is matching their rackets. How many people do you know that have 2 rackets and they've got 2, but one's their favorite, which obviously means one's not matched?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, I still have people come to the shop and say, look, I want to buy a racket, and they go, and I'm going to buy this second racket, a different racket as my backup. And I'm like, well, why would you do that? I mean, the point is you have to have matching rackets. And for juniors particularly, I mean, and especially when you're a teenager, and there are those teenagers on here listening probably, but you've got to remember, you've got to try and take all risk factors out. You've got to try and make sure that you go out with the same gear, with the same strings, at the same tension. You'll notice with pros, for example, I don't know if you know this, but like, for example, if Roger Federer gets 8 rackets strung a day at the Australian Open, he's probably got 6 or 7 of those rackets strung at the same tension, and then he's got another one strung at a different tension to match weather conditions, right? And he's getting his rackets strung at the same time every day, depending on his matching, so the rackets bed in and do what they need to do. So what I would say is that if you're going to have multiple rackets, they need to be exactly the same. If you've got 2 or 3 rackets, they need to be the same weight, they need to be the same grip, they need to be the same string, and they need to be the same tension, because everything is about trying to make sure you reduce risk. And as you know, Craig, have a look at Rafael Nadal. Comes out, puts his bottles the same way, always walks over the baseline with his right foot, always adjusts his socks and his jocks and his headband and his T-shirt and stuff between every point. And the reason why he does that is he's trying to get himself into a risk-free environment, which is going to give him a better opportunity to do what he wants to do. So, and the most common one, and a lot of kids need to understand this, and their coaches are probably telling them, is especially when you serve. You watch some of these players, they'll always serve. They'll bounce the ball 2 or 3 times, then they'll stand up and they'll reload, and they'll bounce the ball another 2 or 3 times, and then they serve. They do it all the time. They never miss it. It's repetition upon repetition upon repetition, so they're taking out the risk of something changing. The second part you've got there, restringing. So,
and I'll put this chart up just while you talk about that one.
Yeah.
The loss of tension.
Oh, okay. So every look, as soon as for example, you bring a racket in for me and I string the racket at 50 pounds. So I can guarantee you, as soon as I take that racket off the machine, within the course of 24 hours, that's dropped X amount of percent of tension. And that gets affected by a few things. What the frame is, what the string is, and what the tension was, right? So you generally find that when you get your racket restrung, you have a hit with it for a bit, it's probably better on its second hit, right? It's probably back because it's played in a little bit more. So they will all lose tension. The rule of thumb used to be, if you played tennis once a week, you get your racket strung once a year, twice a week, twice a year, so on and so forth. I don't know if I'm necessarily a big believer in that. I think you need to, if you're a smart tennis player, you need to be aware that strings will get affected by in winter. Like right now, if you go and have a hit tomorrow and it's been raining all day today, but there's no water on the Ontacar courts, for example, but the soil is still damp, like the Ontacar is still damp, that sucks the life out of your strings. If you're playing in summer and it's stinking hot and it's humid, that sucks the life out of your strings. So you need to be clever enough to go, you know what, I've been playing with this racket for, I don't know, 2 months, and I've been playing 6 days a week, 3 hours a day. I need to probably get it restrung.
Yeah. And hopefully, Luca, that answered your question. I know you asked the question about how does the string tension change over time. And as you can see by the chart here and what Tim just explained, after a month, it depends on the type of string that you're actually using. Some hold their tension better than others. But as Tim said, after 24 hours, the tensions change. So, Tim, is it fair enough to say if I like to have my racket strung at 55, I should ask for 57 and then at least I've got a bit of a buffer in there?
No. You only ever talk about what's going in. Yeah. So without getting into the technicalities, there are 2 different types of tension. One is what goes into the racket, and then there is a tool you can get which isn't overly accurate, which can measure what the racket is when it's strung. Yep. Now, the problem with those is that you're using that mainly as what they call a benchmarking tool. So if you're only doing one racket, it makes no difference. It's what a lot of the pros use if they've got 6 or 7 rackets to try and determine that their rackets have bedded down to the same level. But I've had some quite animated discussions with stringers from around the world, very varying views on whether, in fact, that is accurate and worthwhile even doing. So when you go into a racket shop and you talk about tension, it's always what is being put into the machine going into the racket.
Yeah. And this is our final slide on racket restrings. When should I restring my racket? And there's a bit there about a formula about how often a year I play and multiply that by the number of times I play, and then...
Well, it says there twice a week, twice a year, 3 times a week, 3 times a year. I must admit, from being a junior, the reason why I learned to string when I was in year 8 at high school was I was breaking my strings every 45 minutes. So I don't understand people who can not break strings in a couple of hours. So unfortunately, I'm the type of guy who just break strings all the time. So it's never been an issue for me. My racket and my strings are broken, so they had to be restrung. But what I would say to you is if you want to, if they haven't broken and you want to get some better life into your racket, then at worst case, somewhere between 3 to 6 months, depending on how much you're playing.
Or if my dad's got a racket in the garage that he hasn't brought out for 3 or 4 years, probably wise to have that restrung as well.
Well, I can tell you now, over lockdown, before we had to shut down a few weeks ago, when we were in stage 2 and 3 lockdown, I'd never strung more 15, 20, 30-year-old rackets, which have been sitting in a garage I have in my whole life, purely because back then the only things you could play was tennis or golf. And so every tennis racket you could possibly imagine, things I'd never even seen before, were being brought out of retirement. So, and they definitely needed to be strung.
Wilson 2000s.
I have had the misfortune of stringing one of those, and I'd hopefully never have to do that again.
But is that your worst nightmare, or I've just picked up a head Prestige here? I would say that would have to be one of the worst rackets to string too, isn't it?
Look, yeah, if you bring a head Prestige into our shop, look, they're actually not too bad. But if you have a look down the side, you see how thin the bumper is to get the strings through. So you can't actually string at reasonably good speed without it. You nearly have to sew the string in.
I don't know if you can see that. I'll go up.
Yeah, so it's quite thin. So, yeah, no, don't get me wrong. I won't name rackets, so I don't want to offend anybody. But there are certain rackets that people bring in, and Donna and I just look at them and go, "Oh my god, not these things again." The worst thing to string for me are badminton rackets. They're easy, but I don't like stringing them because the string's really soft, the holes are really small, and I've got sort of stocky fingers, and they're horrible to deal with. So, good rackets to string. Wilson Burns are easy. Yonex Z-Zones are easy. There's a few others, but we'll string anything. Yeah, not a problem.
And we've got one last question before we wrap it up. Savannah has asked the question about, do shoes prevent injury as well, the choice of shoes? And I know you sell a lot of shoes in the shop as well.
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. And I can give you, without getting too much into detail, I'll give you a personal thing on this. I've had some really horrendous foot and knee issues over the course of the last 2 or 3 years. A few months ago, I was in a boot for 2 months, and I have played grade one level tennis, grade 1 level squash. I have put my legs and my feet through untold amount of pain over the last 30 to 40 years, and a lot of the reasons why I've got issues with my feet and my knees now is directly related to the fact that I had really bad shoes when I was younger. Now, I don't know whether Savannah knows what the old Dunlop volleys are like, but when we were kids, we all play with those. And that's pretty much what you had.
We did. I did.
Yeah. Great shoes, durable, but no support, and just flat as a tack. And I can tell you now that, I have now become a very, very, very strong advocate for people getting the right shoes, because if you're going to be playing tennis seriously for the next 20, 30, 40 years, aside from the fact you've got to have your arm to hit the ball, but if you don't have good feet and good legs to get around the court, then it's just as bad. So a couple of examples of shoes, and the different shoes, but for example, things like Asics do really good tennis shoes, sort of a bit more aimed for the people with narrow feet, but Asics make really good running shoes, and in their tennis shoes, they have quite good arch support, right? So where a lot of people like that because they're a bit higher in the arch, and it takes some pressure off the feet. Then you've got things like the Wilson Rush Pros and the Yonex Eclipsions, which are super comfortable shoes. Now, generally speaking, most tennis shoes aren't comfortable, but they're designed for one reason, which is to protect your foot when you're moving side to side on a tennis court. But there seems to be a bit more comfort going in it. K-Swiss tennis shoes, a bit more comfort, and Bablat shoes as well. So we are very, very particular, and actually Donna more so than I am. She's phenomenally good with shoes. I'm probably better with rackets, but I know my shoes. But if you get the opportunity to, if you're looking at shoes, come in and talk to Donna, because she knows so much about shoes, and she's really meticulous in the fitting of them. And if you don't have the right shoes, that can have a really, really adverse effect on your tennis going forward. It might not be now, it might not be in 6 or 12 months, but you'll find in 2 or 3 years' time, when you're suddenly getting tweaks in your knees and tweaks in your feet and things start to hurt, it can be directly attributed back to your shoes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Tim. Now, the last thing, I believe on your website, because we're locked down with COVID-19, you've got the call and collect operating.
Yeah, so basically, unfortunately, because of the stage 4, we've had to lock down my Brighton store, but my Geelong store is still up and running, because they're only in stage 3. A call and collect is a very, very simple process. So we're just going to be having a store. We're not allowed to open the store, but we're going to be available between 11 to 2 Tuesdays and Thursdays. You can ring up and order balls or headbands or grips or whatever you want to do. You can order them over the phone with Donna and myself. You pay for them over the phone, and then you can come down and pick them up at the front of the store. And basically how that works is when you get to the front of the store, you call the shop number or our mobile numbers. All the details are on our website. We will have taken payment over the phone. We'll leave the package for you at the front of the shop. And basically you pick it up and away you go. So it's contactless. It's COVID safe. We know there's not a lot of people playing tennis unless they've got private courts and stuff, but we've had a few people who've utilised it over the course of the last week or two, so we've formally put that in place. So we're hoping to be back up and running in mid-September when all this is said and done, and be back to our normal hours. And a lot of new rackets coming in September, October. So hopefully, if this all goes away, it'll be a pretty good lead into summer tennis.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, Tim. Thank you for those people who joined us live. I hope you're enjoying the recording if you're watching that. I know all you people who joined us live tonight, you'll also be joining us for Lunchtime Fitness tomorrow. Going on in our webinars, we do have a Sunday fitness session at 9:30 with Emma Brooke, and that'll be fantastic. That'll be a tough one for you, so that'll go for an hour. Lunchtimes will go all through next week, and if you join us on Tuesday night, we will have Kiana Mokhtari and Cliff Lube talking about how you transition from junior tournaments to the ITF events. And then we'll be joined by Tina Samara on Saturday morning. Who'll tell us how we get, she's a college recruiter and a college coach, and she's going to tell us that college system. So there are a bunch of other pathways through tennis. And so thank you very much, Tim. Have a great night.
Thanks, Hammy, and thanks for people watching. And if they've got any questions, shoot them through. Be happy to answer them at any stage.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. Good night, everybody.
See you all. Bye.